I had always thought I knew the limits of cruelty, but nothing could have prepared me for the words that came out of my father's mouth that night. It was late summer, one of those humid evenings when the air felt heavy, when sweat clung to the back of your neck no matter how still you sat. We were at his house, the place that used to be my childhood home, though it hadn't felt like mine in years. The kitchen smelled faintly of stale beer and overcooked meat. My stepmother Linda had set the table with her usual cold precision knives and forks gleaming in the yellow light napkins folded sharp enough to slice skin. My half-brother Derek leaned back in his chair, scrolling through his phone, smirking at something only he found funny. And then, my father Raymond lifted his glass, sneered across the table, and said, "You should have died instead of your mother." For a moment, I couldn't breathe. The words landed like a fist in my stomach, like ice poured straight into my veins. My mind split in two. Part of me was the little girl who used to wait by the window for him to come home from work, praying he would smile at me. The other part was the woman sitting at his table, now realizing he truly wished I had been buried in the ground instead of the woman who gave me life. Linda didn't flinch. In fact, her lips curled upward, almost pleased, as if she had been waiting for him to say it out loud. Derek chuckled, shaking his head, muttering harsh "Dad," but I get it. I stared at them, all the three people who were supposed to be my family, feeling the walls tilt, feeling the floor unsteady under my chair. But I didn't break. I didn't cry. My hands clenched under the table nails, biting into my palms until I could feel the sting of blood, but I held my gaze steady on him. He thought I would collapse. He thought I would run. He thought those words would finally shatter me completely. I swallowed the lump in my throat and made a decision right then. I was done being the quiet survivor in his house of cruelty. I would not walk away this time. I would not let those words sink into my bones like poison. I would not give him that satisfaction. Instead, I would take everything he tried to destroy me with and turn it back on him. That sentence, "You should have died instead of your mother," was not just an insult. It was evidence. It was a confession of hatred, of abuse, of the years of torment he thought I had no proof of. But he had just given me the final piece I needed. I remembered every bruise he left, every slammed door, every time he forced silence into my throat with threats and fists. And now, in front of witnesses, he had put the deepest cruelty into words. He laughed then, a sharp, bitter sound that cut through me like glass, and lifted his fork as if nothing had happened. Linda picked up her wine. Derek tapped out a message on his phone, and for a second it was as if no one had noticed my existence at all. That was the moment that burned itself into my memory, the moment when cruelty turned into clarity. They thought I would leave. They thought I would carry that sentence like a weight around my neck. But I knew as I forced myself to keep breathing that one day soon I would make him eat those words in a courtroom under oath where his sneer would not save him. The air felt hot. My face burned, but inside something colder and harder was forming. He thought he had killed me with a sentence. What he didn't know was that he had just given me the fire I needed to fight back. The words still echoed in my ears as the meal dragged on, my father chewing with satisfaction as though nothing had been said, Linda sipping her wine in a display of icy calm. Derek stretching his legs out to block the narrow space behind my chair so I could not leave even if I wanted to. That was the cruelest part of it all. Not just the sentence itself, but the way they carried on as though humiliating me was simply part of the evening routine, as though my existence was nothing more than a disposable piece of theater staged for their amusement. The food on my plate turned cold, untouched, but every time I tried to rise, Linda's hand darted out to push the serving dish closer. Her smile so tight it looked painted on as she whispered almost sweetly, "Sit down, Clara, you're making a scene." Derek chuckled, leaning close enough for me to smell the cheap cologne that clung to him, muttering under his breath, "Dad's right, you know Mom was worth 1,000 of you." My fists clenched so hard beneath the table that the knuckles turned white, but I forced myself to keep my posture straight because if there was one thing I had learned growing up under this roof, it was that showing pain only made them hungrier. Raymond banged his fork against his plate, the sound like a gavel declaring my sentence, and announced to no one in particular, She should be grateful I still let her sit here at all, considering what a disappointment she's turned out to be. The words sliced into me sharper than any blade yet. None of them looked my way. Not Linda, who had stolen my mother's place at this very table. Not Derek, who strutted with the confidence of someone who never earned anything he had, and certainly not Raymond, whose sneer was carved into his face like stone. My breath grew shallow, my vision blurred with the humiliation of being invisible, while simultaneously being dissected in full view. Every laugh, every shrug, every clink of glass was a reminder that I was no longer part of this family, that they had rewritten the story so thoroughly, that I was now the intruder in my own home. I thought of how my mother used to set this table with care, the scent of her cooking filling the house with warmth, her voice humming while she moved from stove to oven. I remembered how she would place her hand softly on mine when Dad's temper flared her touch, the only shield between me and the storm. And now, here I sat in the same kitchen surrounded by faces that bore no trace of love, only derision, as if the years of sacrifice I had given after she died meant nothing. Linda leaned in, then her voice low and laced with poison. "Do you know what your problem is, Clara? You hold on to the past like it owes you something. You should just move on and accept your place." Her eyes glittered, and I realized with a cold jolt that this was her victory to see me diminished, to watch me swallow insult after insult until I finally broke. But I didn't. My throat tightened, my pulse hammered in my temples, but I met her gaze and let silence stretch between us because silence was the only weapon I had in that moment, the only thing that could unnerve her. Derek scoffed, flicking crumbs from his fingers and blocking the doorway more deliberately as though daring me to try to leave. Dad smirked, pushing his empty glass toward me. "Get me another drink since you insist on being here." That command was worse than the insult, a declaration that no matter what I achieved outside this house, I would always be a servant here, an afterthought, a mistake kept alive out of stubbornness. My body screamed to flee, but my mind held me firm, whispering that if I endured this night, I would have everything I needed later. Their arrogance was the crack in their armor. Every word, every sneer, every act of cruelty was not just pain, it was evidence. It was proof that one day soon, when the lights of a courtroom replaced the dim yellow bulbs of this kitchen, they would not be able to laugh it off. The humiliation seared me, but beneath it was something stronger. Harder, a promise that I would make them pay for every time they treated me as less than human. I sat there as though nailed to the chair, the weight of their contempt pressing down on me like iron, but in that pressure, something unbreakable was forged. They believed they had cornered me, trapped me in a web of silence and shame, but what they had really done was hand me the rope with which to drag them all into the light. I remembered the first time my father's voice had turned from strict to cruel long before that dinner, long before Linda's smirk or Derek's mocking laughter back when my mother was still alive, and the house carried traces of love in its corners. I had been 12 too small to carry the weight of groceries, but doing it anyway, because Mom asked softly, and because Dad refused. He had been sitting in his chair watching television when she asked him for help, and he barked at her that she had legs, and so did I. That was when I first learned that in his eyes my worth was measured only in what I could carry or clean or obey. When Mom died suddenly years later, cancer tearing her apart faster than anyone expected, I thought at least grief might soften him, that losing her might make him cling tighter to me. Instead, it was as though my existence became unbearable to him. Like every time he looked at me, he saw the ghost of the woman he lost, and he punished me for it. I gave up my place at college deferred enrollment so I could stay home with him because he swore he could not manage the bills, could not manage Derek, could not manage life. I worked double shifts at the diner pouring coffee for truckers at 3 a.m., stumbling home to find him passed out drunk and bills still unpaid. I emptied the small savings account my mother had left for me. Money, she whispered, was for my future, and used it to keep the lights on and food in the fridge, never telling anyone that I was the reason the house had not been repossessed. I patched Derek's school uniforms, bought his textbooks, showed up at parent meetings while Linda painted her nails or went shopping. I carried that house on my back like an unwilling mule, and every time Dad spat that I was useless, Every time Linda said I was only there because no one else would have me, I bit down hard and told myself family was worth it. But the bruises told a different story, the ones he left on my arms when he grabbed me too hard, the split lip from the night I dared to ask where Mom's jewelry had gone, only to be thrown against the wall the nights I pressed a bag of frozen peas to my face while Linda scolded me for provoking him. I documented it in scraps, not even realizing at first why I saved them photographs of Bruce's bank slips proving deposits I made into his account, copies of my mother's will that mysteriously vanished from his desk, only to reappear with amendments in Linda's handwriting. At the time, I thought maybe one day I would need to prove to myself that I had not imagined it, that the pain and sacrifice were real, but now I saw them for what they were. Fragments of a case building piece by piece. I thought of Mom's voice in the hospital, weak but steady, telling me to be strong, telling me not to let him break me, and I remembered promising her that I would keep the family together. But the family had never been together, not in the way she imagined, not in the way she hoped when she gave him the best years of her life. Instead, it had been a cage, and I had been the bird who clipped her own wings just to stay inside. Every humiliation at that dinner table brought the memories sharper into focus the times I held Derek's hand through nightmares while Dad slammed doors the times I signed away opportunities because Linda insisted I was needed at home. The hours of my youth traded for survival in a house that wanted me gone. And now, as I sat there with the taste of blood still in my mouth from his slap, I realized those sacrifices had not been for family, they had been for control. They wanted me tethered, dependent, broken. But in truth, every receipt, every bruise, every sleepless night was not just suffering, it was ammunition, and I was done wasting it on silence. I would gather it all, sharpen it, and the very weight they had chained me with would be the evidence that destroyed them. The night did not end with words alone, because Raymond had never been satisfied with words when fists and force could do the job more thoroughly and more cruelly, and that evening he made sure I remembered that fact. After he sneered that I should have died instead of my mother, and after Linda delivered her venomous whispers and Derek blocked the exit like a guard dog. My father slammed his hand on the table with such force that the glasses rattled and the meat knife clattered to the floor. The sudden violence of the sound made my heart lurch, but I forced myself not to flinch, 'cause I knew that was what he wanted. He rose slowly, looming over me with the heavy smell of alcohol on his breath, and he barked, "You think you deserve to sit here. You think this is your home. You are nothing but a stain that never washed out after your mother left me with you." He grabbed my phone from the edge of the table, the one I had placed there to feel some semblance of connection to the outside world, and before I could react, he smashed it against the tile floor. The screen cracked instantly, shards scattering like tiny stars, and Derek laughed as though it were the funniest thing he had ever seen. Linda covered her mouth in feigned shock, but I caught the glint of satisfaction in her eyes. I bent instinctively to gather the pieces, and that was when he yanked me up by the arm so hard I felt something pop in my shoulder. The pain shot white hot through my body, but I bit down on the scream, refusing to give him that pleasure. He shoved me against the wall, my head snapping back against the plaster, a dull ache blooming at the base of my skull. His face was inches from mine, his spit flecking my cheek as he hissed, "You don't walk out of here unless I say so." Linda's voice floated behind him, calm as a lullaby. "She just doesn't understand, Raymond. She'll learn if you teach her." Those words made bile rise in my throat because she wanted this. She wanted me broken and obedient and invisible. Derek took out his phone and started recording his grin. Wide, his voice muttering, "This is gold. Wait until my friends see how pathetic she is." In that moment, I saw the circle clearly. My father, the tyrant, Linda, the enabler, Derek, the apprentice, all three feeding off my pain as if it were sustenance. My chest heaved with the effort of staying upright, but inside I felt something calcify, something that whispered no more. He released me with a shove that sent me sprawling across the floor, my elbow scraping raw against the tile, and he pointed toward the door. Not to let me leave, but to humiliate me further, snarling, "Crawl out like the mistake you are." The sting of humiliation burned more than the physical pain, and yet instead of crawling, I pushed myself up slowly, my legs trembling but steadying with each inch. And I stared at him with a calmness that surprised even me. He expected collapse, he expected submission, but what he got was a silent defiance that unsettled him. For the briefest second, a flicker of doubt in his eyes that told me he knew I was no longer the girl he could terrify into obedience. Derek's laughter filled the room loud and cruel. Linda's nails tapped rhythmically against her glass, like a metronome for my humiliation, and Raymond finally roared, "Get out before I decide you're not worth the oxygen!" And then his hand came down across my face with such force that the metallic taste of blood filled my mouth instantly. My lips split, my cheeks stung, my eyes watered, but I did not scream. I did not beg. I picked up the shattered remains of my phone, the last link to the outside world, and I walked toward the door, Derek blocking it until Raymond growled, "Let her go. She'll come crawling back anyway. They always do." And with that, I was shoved into the night, the rain pelting against my skin, my blood mixing with water as I stumbled to my car. My hands trembled on the steering wheel, my reflection in the rearview mirror unrecognizable. But instead of despair, I felt clarity because the violence had stripped away the last veil of family obligation. What remained was proof undeniable and raw that this was no longer about survival but about justice, and the bruises on my body would not be hidden, they would be weaponized. I sat in the driver's seat with the rain hammering down on the windshield, the drops streaking so fast it looked like the world outside was melting, and in the blur of water and streetlights, I saw my face in the mirror. Split lip, swollen cheek, eyes rimmed red, not from tears but from fury so sharp it almost steadied me. My hands shook as I touched the cut at the corner of my mouth, and for the first time I did not hear my father's voice booming in my skull. I heard my mother's voice, faint but steady, whispering from memory, "Never let silence become your prison. Clara, never give them your silence." I had given him silence for years, endured the insults, the bruises, the theft of my youth, the gaslighting from Linda, the mockery from Derek. I had swallowed it all because I told myself survival was more important than pride. But pride was all that was left now. Pride and evidence, bruises and bank slips, and a broken phone that still carried the fragments of calls I had tried to make text messages, unanswered, drafts unsent. I touched the cracked glass of the screen and whispered to myself that I was done, waiting for a miracle I would become my own. The ache in my shoulder throbbed every time I shifted, reminding me of the force with which he had yanked me like I was a rag, but instead of weakness, it became a pulse of determination, each throb telling me this body was still mine. That pain was proof of survival, and survival was no longer enough. I remembered the way Derek had recorded me sprawled on the floor, his laugh echoing, and I pictured his face when that recording would be turned against him, projected in a courtroom, his cruelty exposed not as entertainment, but as evidence. I remembered Linda's icy whisper, "She'll learn if you teach her," and I pictured her lips tightening when a judge read out the list of her complicity financial fraud tied to her neat handwriting manipulation, documented in every check she signed with my father. And I remembered Raymond's sneer, "You should have died instead of your mother." And I felt the rage twist into something sharper than grief, because those words would not be the final chapter. They would be the opening line in the case that buried him. I gripped the steering wheel so tight my knuckles whitened, and I made an oath to myself right there in the rain. No more tears, no more silence, no more begging to be seen. I would not crawl back. I would not plead for scraps of affection. I would stand in front of him not as his daughter, but as his accuser, and I would strip from him every ounce of control he thought he had. My oath was not whispered in prayer. It was carved into me with every bruise, every scar, every insult he had hurled across the years, and it rang louder than the storm outside. I would take him to court. I would drag his name through records, through hearings, through depositions, until every lie crumbled. I would not just survive him, I would dismantle him. I leaned back in the seat, the rain softening slightly as though the sky had finished its tantrum, and for the first time in years, I felt the faintest sense of control. Not because I had escaped, but because I had decided. My decision was my weapon. My oath was my armor, and his cruelty was my evidence. I closed my eyes for a moment, exhaustion pulling at me, but behind the darkness there was no despair, only resolve. When I opened them again, I saw the outline of the house behind me, warm lights glowing in the windows, laughter spilling faintly into the night, the picture of a family gathered together. But I knew the truth now that house was a stage set, the family an illusion, and I was done being their scapegoat. I whispered into the empty car, "Mom, I'm not breaking anymore. I'm fighting," and the sound of my own voice was like a promise etched into stone. The next morning, the bruise on my cheek had deepened to a sickly purple, and the cut on my lip stung with every sip of coffee, but I drank it anyway because pain was fuel now. And fuel was what I needed as I began the work of building my case brick by brick without telling anyone a word. I started with the folder I had hidden years ago beneath the loose board in my closet, the one that held copies of bank statements, pay stubs, and the will my mother had signed in her fragile handwriting, a will that mysteriously disappeared after her funeral and reappeared months later with revisions that favored my father and Linda. I laid everything out on my kitchen table, each paper like a weapon, each bruise in the photographs I had secretly taken like a blade sharpened over time. Then I picked up the phone, not the shattered one my father had destroyed, but a cheap replacement I bought in cash, and called the one person I thought might listen without pity, Ms. Howard, an attorney I had met once while working late shifts at the diner when she left her card after hearing me mention my father's temper. Her voice was calm, but clipped when I explained, and she didn't ask if I was exaggerating. She simply said, "Bring everything, do not confront him again, and come see me this afternoon." That command steadied me more than any comfort could. I dressed carefully, hiding the bruise with makeup that could never fully conceal it, but dulled its edge, pulling my hair back to look deliberate wearing the blazer I had kept from my short-lived office job before Dad forced me to quit. When I entered Ms. Howard's office, the air smelled of leather and paper solid and serious, and I felt for the first time that someone believed me. She studied the documents, her brow tightening, her pen scratching notes, and she told me plainly that what I endured was not only abuse, but theft, financial fraud, coercion, and violence, each with legal consequences. My father would expect me to cower. Linda would expect me to swallow. Derek would expect me to stay silent. But together their arrogance had painted a target on their backs. I listened, taking in her strategy, the steps of filing protective orders, freezing accounts, subpoenaing records, and I realized this was not going to be a secret rebellion. This was going to be war fought in daylight. When I left her office, I carried more than papers. I carried a checklist, a path to justice, and though my legs trembled as I walked to the car, my spine felt straighter than it had in years. That night I rehearsed conversations in my mind, the things I would no longer swallow, and I began planting seeds, sending small inquiries to banks, requesting copies of records, storing everything in cloud drives under aliases, so nothing could vanish if my father tried to destroy it again. Every click of the keyboard, every folder labeled was like a strike back at him, silent but certain. When Linda called the next day to mock me about leaving the dinner so dramatically, I recorded the call, her words dripping with contempt, her admission that I had no place in their home becoming yet another piece of evidence. When Derek sent me a message with the blurry video of me on the floor, captioned with pathetic, "I did not cry," I saved it because cruelty was proof and proof was power. For the first time, I stopped feeling like a victim and started feeling like an architect building a fortress from the very stones they had hurled at me. The silence that once suffocated me had become my strategy, my cover, my preparation. They thought I had crawled away into the shadows, but in truth, I was in the shadows, sharpening my knives, waiting for the moment to step back into the light with every weapon they had handed me. The night of the confrontation arrived faster than I expected, and it began with a calculated invitation, a message I sent to my father, phrased carefully so he would think he was in control, that I wanted to come by and talk things through like family, that I was ready to admit fault for disrupting dinner. Predictably, he took the bait, replying with a single command, "Be here at 7." And when I walked up the steps of that house, my heart pounded, but not from fear, from anticipation, because hidden in my bag was the recorder Ms. Howard had lent me, slim and silent, ready to capture what I knew he could not resist saying. Linda opened the door with a smile sharp enough to cut glass, ushering me in as though I were a guest rather than the daughter whose blood had built the foundation of the home. Derek lounging on the couch with his phone already in his hand, smirk curling his lips as if he were preparing for another spectacle. My father entered last slow and heavy, his presence filling the room like a storm about to break, and he wasted no time barking. "So you finally crawled back, figured out you can't survive without me." And I kept my eyes steady, my voice calm, knowing every word was being recorded. I told him I wanted to resolve things, that I wanted us to talk, and he laughed, a deep, cruel sound mocking. "You don't resolve trash. Clara, you throw it out." And then he stepped closer, too close, grabbing my shoulder and shoving me against the wall. Linda's voice cooed from behind him. "She needs to be taught, Ray. She'll never learn unless you make her." And Derek's laugh joined in, his camera angled toward me like this was another piece of content to share. My chest tightened, the ache from my bruises roaring back, but my mind was sharper than my body. I did not scream. I did not beg. I said quietly, "You're hurting me again." And his answer, "You deserve worse than this," rang clear into the hidden mic. The argument escalated, his voice rising, his fists slamming against the table so hard a plate shattered. Linda clapping her hands as if it were a performance, Derek jeering, asking if I wanted him to post this too. My father yanked my hair back, snarling, "I'll make sure you regret ever walking into my house." And that was when the knock came hard and sudden, the front door swinging open as 2 police officers stepped in, called by the neighbor who had heard the screams and the crash of dishes. The scene froze for a second, Raymond's hand still twisted in my hair, Linda's mouth open, mid-laugh. Derek's phone pointed like a weapon, and the officers shouted, "Let her go, now!" He released me, but too late, the red marks on my neck, plain, the broken plate glittering on the floor, the recorder in my bag capturing every word and every threat. I stood shaking but steady as the officers questioned, and when they asked if I wanted to press charges, I looked at my father, his sneer cracking into something almost uncertain, and I said, "Yes." Derek tried to bluster that I was exaggerating. Linda insisted it was a family misunderstanding, but the officers had seen enough, they had heard enough, and when they pulled him toward the door in handcuffs, the sight of his rage, caged for the first time in my life, burned itself into me like light through stained glass. He shouted that I was ungrateful, that I was betraying blood, but I knew what I was doing was not betrayal, it was justice. And as the door shut behind them, I pressed my hand to my aching scalp and whispered to myself that the war had begun, and this time it would be fought on my terms. The courtroom was colder than I expected, the kind of chill that seeps into your bones and makes you question if you really belong there. But as I sat at the plaintiff's table with Ms. Howard beside me, her papers stacked in neat, precise piles, I realized this was the first space where my father's voice did not drown out my own. He sat across the aisle in a suit that strained against his shoulders, his sneer dulled into a tight jaw. Linda by his side, dressed in pale gray, as though she were the grieving victim. Derek slouched a row behind them, trying to look innocent, phone tucked away, but smirk still curling at the corner of his mouth. The judge entered the room, rose, and when everyone sat again, I felt the weight of decades pressing down, not just mine, but every woman who had ever been told to be silent, every daughter told she was unworthy, every voice drowned by a father's rage. "Ms. Howard spoke first, her tone clear and unshaken, presenting the photographs of my bruises, the medical report from the night I stumbled into urgent care, the bank slips showing deposits from my account into his, the copy of my mother's will with Linda's handwriting scrawled across amendments. And finally, she played the recordings, the words spilling into the courtroom like acid, my father's growl. "You should have died," instead of your mother echoing so loudly it silenced even Derek's grin. Linda's whispers followed. "She needs to be taught, Ray. She'll never learn unless you make her." And the laughter of my half-brother sealed the image of complicity, a family built on cruelty. My father's lawyer tried to object, calling it family matters, but the judge's gavel came down sharp. "Abuse and fraud are not family matters. Counsel, they are crimes." When it was my turn to speak, My hands trembled as I took the stand, but my voice, though quivering at first, grew stronger with each sentence as I recounted the years of sacrifice. The tuition deferred, the paychecks handed over, the bruises hidden under sleeves. The nights I played mother to Derek while Linda paraded as wife, the betrayal layered so deep it almost buried me. My father's gaze bored into me cold and venomous, but for once it could not stop the words. For once, my testimony was louder than his silence. He was called to the stand, and his arrogance betrayed him, every denial undercut by the recordings, every claim of discipline dismantled by photographs, every attempt to paint me as unstable, broken by Ms. Howard's steady cross-examination. He snapped, finally, voice rising. "She's nothing. She's always been nothing." And the judge's expression hardened, the gallery shifting uneasily at the raw hatred laid bare. By the time the closing arguments came, the case was no longer about a daughter seeking relief. It was about a man exposed as a tyrant, a woman unmasked as an enabler, and a son revealed as a participant in cruelty. The verdict landed like thunder, guilty on charges of assault and battery, guilty on financial misappropriation, guilty on coercion. My father's bail was revoked. Linda's assets frozen pending investigation. Derek subpoenaed for distribution of illegal recordings. As the gavel fell and the guards moved to escort him out, he twisted once to glare at me, spitting that I would regret this. But his voice had no power here. It was just noise echoing in a chamber that no longer belonged to him. I sat back, every muscle taut, every nerve alive, and for the first time I understood what it meant to feel the ground under me steady, to feel justice not as an abstract idea, but as a living thing, wrapping itself around my bruises and saying, "You are not invisible anymore." When we stepped out into the daylight, reporters swarmed, microphones flashing, and though I had not planned to speak, I found myself turning toward the cameras, my words spilling clear. Toxic families survive on silence, but silence ends here if you are told you are worthless. Prove them wrong in court, because that is where real justice begins. The crowd murmured, flashes went off, and Ms. Howard placed a firm hand on my shoulder as if to anchor me, but I already felt anchored by something stronger than law or cameras. I felt anchored by my own decision never to break again. The days that followed the verdict were not the triumphant blur I imagined, but a slow burn of consequences unfurling one after another until the full weight of what had been done to me and what had been taken from me finally landed where it belonged. The house that had once been my mother's pride, the house I had kept afloat with diner wages and sleepless nights, was seized under court order as evidence of fraud, its locks changed, its windows sealed, its accounts frozen. I drove past it once, the yard overgrown, the lights dark for sale. Notice taped to the front door, and instead of sadness, I felt a hollow kind of satisfaction because it no longer held me hostage. Linda's name appeared in newspapers, her photographs splashed across articles about collusion and fraud, the community she once ruled with manicured nails and tight smiles now whispering her downfall. She tried calling me once, her number flashing across my phone, but I let it ring until it died, because what was there to say when complicity had been recorded in her own words? Derek's bravado crumbled faster than theirs. His phone seized, his online accounts combed through, his so-called friends summoned to testify about the videos he had shared. He posted a pitiful apology online, claiming he hadn't realized the seriousness, that he was just joking. But the footage of me sprawled on the kitchen floor with his laughter in the background told a story no excuse could erase. My father remained behind bars while sentencing loomed, his letters to me intercepted by my attorney. Pages filled with venom, with curses, with desperate threats dressed as appeals, and each one went into a folder marked evidence, another nail in the coffin of his credibility. At night, I lay in bed and listened to the quiet. No footsteps stomping down the hall. No doors slamming. No shouts slicing the air. And at first, the silence felt foreign, almost unbearable, because I had been conditioned to brace for violence, but gradually it became a balm. I began to eat again without nausea, twisting. My stomach began to laugh in small bursts at things as simple as a sitcom rerun began to breathe without counting seconds between heartbeats. Yet the true aftermath was not just in my healing, but in the ripple that reached outward. Former neighbors came forward admitting they had heard arguments that they had seen bruises that they had suspected but never acted, and though their words stung, they added weight to my case proof that I had not been invisible, only ignored. The local paper ran an editorial about breaking the silence around family abuse using my case as a headline, and though part of me recoiled from the exposure, another part knew it was necessary that my story was no longer just mine, but a weapon for others trapped in homes like mine. The financial restitution ordered by the court began to take shape. Assets redirected accounts, unfrozen checks cut in my name. But the money mattered less than the principle that every dollar stolen from my mother's legacy, every hour I had worked to prop up their lies, was now acknowledged in writing, stamped with a judge's seal. Consequences spread like cracks in glass, splintering outward, touching every part of their lives, leaving me no longer the scapegoat, but the survivor who had forced accountability into the open. I visited my mother's grave once during those weeks, setting down fresh flowers, my fingers brushing the cold stone as I whispered, "He can't hurt me anymore," and for the first time I believed it. The air felt different then, lighter, cleaner, as if the earth itself approved of justice done. And though I knew scars would remain, though nightmares would still creep into my sleep, I also knew the balance had shifted, the burden lifted, and the aftermath was not chaos, but clarity. The punishment was not just legal. It was personal, social, financial, and permanent, and I walked away knowing that for once they were the ones left crawling, stripped of power, stripped of control, stripped of the illusion that I would always bend. In the months after the trial, the world did not transform into some fairy tale of peace, but it did become mine again in a way it had never been, and that alone was enough to feel like freedom. I found a small apartment across town, nothing grand, just 2 rooms with sunlight that streamed in during the morning and the sound of neighbors who said hello instead of whispering. The first night I slept there, I left the windows cracked open, the cool breeze carrying in the scent of rain, and I realized I was not listening for footsteps anymore, not holding my breath for a door to slam. I was just listening to the world move gently outside my own walls. Healing did not come in one sweeping moment, but in rituals, in the way I brewed coffee and let the smell fill the kitchen without fear of it being overturned, in the way I cooked small meals for myself and ate them slowly, without anyone mocking me, in the way I laughed with Kay, the neighbor who knocked one evening with soup and stayed to gossip about trivial things that felt monumental because they were safe. I took long walks sometimes, passing children playing on sidewalks, and I thought of the younger me who once carried groceries too heavy for her arms, and I whispered to that girl that she made it out, that she did not break. Therapy sessions gave shape to the chaos, my voice cracking, as I admitted the years of silence, the nights of terror, the twisted loyalty to a man who had wished me dead, and each session was like peeling away a layer of rot until there was room for something alive underneath. The legal documents arrived finalized. My father sentenced Linda stripped of assets, Derek still answering to probation officers, and though their names no longer had power over me, the paperwork was a reminder that justice had been carved in ink. I donated a portion of the restitution to a shelter for women leaving abusive homes, because I wanted my victory to ripple outward, because I wanted someone else's silence to break faster than mine had. And slowly, I built a life where I was not defined by wounds, but by choices. I hung art on my walls. I planted herbs in little pots on the balcony. I wrote in journals not to record pain, but to capture growth. Some nights, fear still crept in shadows long across the floor, but I would breathe, place a hand over the scar on my lip, and remind myself that scars are proof of healing, not of defeat. One evening, I stood in front of the mirror, touching the faint line where the bruise had once been, and I whispered the words my father had thrown at me, "You should have died instead of your mother." And then I answered aloud with steady conviction, "I lived, and that is the greatest rebellion." That became my message, the one I shared when a reporter followed up months later asking what I wanted others to know. I told her toxic families survive on silence, that shame is their weapon, but that silence can be shattered, and once it is broken, they cannot rebuild it. My words were printed the next week, and strangers sent letters thanking me, telling me they were leaving, that they were filing, that they were done being silent. In those letters, I saw my mother's promise fulfilled, that her daughter would not fold, that her daughter would survive, and more than that, would fight. On the anniversary of her death, I visited her grave again, placing sunflowers this time, and I sat by the stone reading a letter I had written her telling her about the trial about the apartment, about the laughter that was returning in small pieces, and I told her that even though he had wished me gone, I had chosen to live fully and loudly. When I rose to leave, I felt lighter as though I was carrying her blessing with me. The final chapter was not about courtrooms or verdicts or frozen accounts. It was about reclaiming breath, reclaiming space, reclaiming the right to sit at my own table without fear. And that is the message I carry now to anyone who listens, that survival is not the end. Justice is not the end. Healing is the end and the beginning all at once. I am not the forgotten daughter anymore, not the victim bent beneath his hand. I am the woman who stood in the light of truth and refused to break, and in choosing to live, I have become everything he could not destroy.